And we did run articles by our city editor right up to the wire saying, don't let's forget the economy is in very bad shape. We didn't bathe all that in a false glow, but of course we did put a better gloss on it than one normally would.
The Conservative press has stopped being devotional and deferential and has begun to recognise its own strength. That does not derive from being nice to the Conservatives and the Conservatives being nice to them and only beating up those dreadful Labour boys from down the street who are so common. They're flexing muscles they didn't know they had.
But something else was at work here. Behind the overt published support lay a powerful subtext, a lingering regret at the loss of Margaret Thatcher. In the 16 months of Major's leadership leading up to the election, newspapers had constantly assessed his personality and policies by contrasting them with those of Mrs. Thatcher. At one level, Major's problem is simple. He isn't Mrs. Thatcher.
None of them wished Mrs. Margaret Thatcher to go. And so John Major got the job. He was her candidate. And to the distress of the Tory press, John Major refused to conform to type. John Major went his own way. John Major was suddenly revealed to be, for example, rather pro-European.
They liked Margaret Thatcher because she was exciting and sexy, and she was, George be a king. She was a king. She was a leader figure, and there's a sort of watered fascism around which basically wants to straight arm a little bit and worship a great leader. And I think that you could say that there are, in parts of the press, minds of a certain primary colour, a certain crudeness of outlook, which is happier with something uncomplicatedly authoritarian.
Having helped take the Conservative Party back into power, the suppressed grievances of the press's Thatcherite wing could now safely be aired in print. This was a gradual process in which broadsheets and tabloids followed a different agenda. Early broadsheet criticism centred on Major's style, though the Sunday Times was consistently concerned at the economic outlook. There was an assumption that Europe was a good thing, except among a clique of journalists led by Charles Moore.
This isn't some sort of personal campaign. What's wrong is that we have the wrong European and economic policy, and the two are related, and they affect everything else. And until they change, one has to go on and on arguing that point.
Once it became clear that Major was going to embrace the Maastricht Treaty, then the tabloids, particularly the Populist Sun, aware of a xenophobic streak among its readers, joined the fray. Now the broadsheet and tabloids had common cause. Even the European dispute might not have proved so disastrous for Major's press relationship had it not been linked to the country's economic problems. For the tabloid press, Black Wednesday was the catalyst. Newspapers launched an unprecedented onslaught on his economic strategy. Major became a target for vicious attacks as events unfolded. The Sun.
Dear Mr. Major, do you have a plan to get us out of this bloody mess?
The Daily Mail.
The devalued Chancellor.
The Daily Telegraph.
The political cost of an economic disaster.
The Daily Express.
Painful lesson for John Major.
Now, nice Mr. Major, or honest John, could do no right, even if he took press advice.
The press said, John Major must cut interest rates. He cut interest rates on Friday, immediately, within 12 hours. Every newspaper, John Major's panicked, he's cut interest rates. Now that is not political reporting. That is something very deeper. There's something deeper going on there.
Essentially, the argument is that the Tories are now split into two distinct wings.
You see, what happened in the Tory party was, when John Major took over from Margaret Thatcher, there ought to have been some sort of political settlement at that time between the two wings of the party. There was no settlement. There is another political party in operation in this country, and that political party is the Thatcherite political party.
Politics aside, lest we forget, newspapers are businesses too. Businesses which are, by their nature, volatile. Readers can register their views about their newspaper with an immediacy and a finality which no editor can afford to ignore.
I think what we have seen is newspapers getting caught up in a political crisis. After all, we're living in a political and economic crisis which we haven't seen for, 60 years? And it would be very strange, even in our entertainment-based tabloids, if they weren't reflecting the anger of their readers. the hopelessness of their readers, certainly if they wish to carry on selling copies.
When the Sun insulted Liverpool fans after the Hillsborough disaster, sales on Merseyside plummeted and have never recovered to their former level. Unsurprisingly then, the Sun remains aware of the commercial good sense in not straying too far from its readership. Its populism depends on a subtle reciprocity. Sometimes the voice in the pub is relayed in the Sun, often the Sun provides the subject of pub conversation.
There is a momentous split within the Conservative Party, and that's what the Sun reflects. But not because we're concerned about the way politicians feel about it, because we're concerned about the way our readers feel about it. They are scared stiff with the way this country seems to be drifting along at the moment, and we voice their concern.
Mr. Major may not have seen it that way, but the Sun's leader writer does make a genuine point. Newspaper propaganda is all very well, but if it's too divorced from reality, then the readers will see through it. And this may explain why proprietors stood back and allowed their editors such freedom.
In my 30-year career in newspapers, one hasn't seen such a united onslaught on a government as this. I mean, the Suez crisis split the nation, but there were papers on both sides. What was utterly remarkable on Sunday was that all 9 major national newspapers were saying Major is wrong, do something.
Major's task to regain his press friendship is relatively straightforward. All he has to do is put the economy back on a sound footing, and all that will go in the dustbin of history. But more realistically, we might ask whether the press has so severely weakened the Prime Minister's public standing that, in a crisis, he could no longer count on the support from the majority of the population.
Roy Greenslade. Tomorrow night's programme is a late show special, profiling a different kind of engineer, Spanish architect, sculptor and bridge builder Santiago Calatrava. From me, good night.
Next to him